It was, as far as Flaxborough afternoons went, unusually uneventful. The town's spring flower show was in full swing in the village hall, and a mild sunlight filtered through the tall windows, illuminating displays of petunias, begonias, and dahlias with an almost reverential calm. Ladies in sensible hats wandered between tables, whispering evaluations to one another in tones of polite condescension. A trio of men, perhaps unavoidably, had stationed themselves near the refreshment table, where the scent of oversugared tea mingled curiously with that of cut flowers. Inspector Purbright, by contrast, had arrived late, finding the usual chaos of folding chairs and last-minute entrance more charming than irritating. He moved with quiet deliberation, a notebook in hand but largely for appearance, and nodded to acquaintances without urgency. He did not rush. He did not yet have a reason to. The commotion began not with a scream, nor with any alarming noise, but with the gentle shuffle of wings. A small crowd had gathered near the north window, peering down at the alley behind the hall, where a dozen or more crows had assembled in what might have been mistaken for a leisurely promenade. At first glance, the birds seemed drawn simply by curiosity, or perhaps by scraps of cake carelessly discarded from the buffet. Yet, as Purbright edged closer, he saw what had attracted the attention: a small, pale figure crouched among the rubbish bins, feeding the birds by hand. The child was remarkably still, and yet there was something arresting in the deliberate, almost ritualistic manner with which she scattered crumbs. She did not notice the gathering crowd, nor the occasional shooing hands of those who feared the bird's talons. To the unpractised eye, she might have been a picture of innocence. To Purbright, however, she represented an anomaly in Flaxborough's otherwise precise social choreography. "Miss Havisham's children?" whispered one attendee to another in the kind of tone reserved for the morally appropriate disapproval of strangers. "I thought she only had the twins, and they're at boarding school, aren't they?" The child, small and quiet, had no name badge or floral display entry, yet she continued her ministrations with the crows, oblivious to social convention. Then, almost imperceptibly, she paused and looked toward the window. For a second, her gaze met Purbright's. He did not move, merely inclined his head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement. She nodded in return and returned to her task. "Isn't that odd?" murmured Mrs. Crayford, whose own chrysanthemums had won third prize for the 4th year running. "Feeding crows at a flower show? Quite unusual, I think." Purbright made a note, though not in the notebook. There was nothing illegal in feeding birds, certainly, and yet, in Flaxborough, even small eccentricities demanded observation. The child's presence might, in another town, pass without comment. Here, it would become a talking point, a deviation from the ordinary pattern that people relied on for comfort. A faint commotion near the raffle table drew Purbright's attention. Mr. Pettigrew, the town accountant, had discovered that his winnings, the inevitable bottle of brandy, were missing. The volunteers fussed, apologies tumbled, and Mrs. Crayford muttered darkly about theft, though more in the abstract sense of moral laxity than any actual accusation. The child, unperturbed, continued to feed the crows, whose calls now punctuated the small drama unfolding inside the hall. And Purbright, as ever, observed, "Nothing in Flaxborough moved without a reason. Even crows had their patterns." He made a mental note. The incident was trivial. Yet trivialities, he knew, often led to truths quietly and without ceremony. And so the afternoon unfolded with tea drunk, prizes awarded, and the child remaining at her post in the alley, a small figure whose unremarkable peculiarity would soon ripple through the town's delicate social order in ways no one yet suspected. By the following morning, Flaxborough had settled into the peculiar rhythm that always followed a minor disruption. The flower show was over, the dahlias returned to their greenhouses, and the incident of the missing brandy had been carefully explained away as an unfortunate misplacement, though the faint aroma of scandal lingered in the air like oversteeped tea. It was precisely this half-life of events, resolved yet unresolved, that fascinated Purbright. He observed the town from the familiar perch of his office, where papers lay in neat stacks and a kettle hissed quietly on the stove, promising tea at a reasonable interval. The child who fed the crows was already the subject of speculative attention, though no one had yet ventured to approach her. Mrs. Crayford, while attending to her chrysanthemums, had confided to the vicar that she thought it quite extraordinary for a child to wander without supervision, implying subtly that some parental negligence must be at work. Mr. Pettigrew, having recovered his bottle of brandy, nonetheless informed the town clerk that a theft at a flower show, however minor, cannot be ignored. It's the principle. Each remark, small in itself, gathered weight as gossip in Flaxborough's tight social circuits, and Purbright, with his quiet patience, began to map the variations in these accounts. The local newspaper, Flaxborough, weekly did its duty to embellish, reporting that a mysterious young visitor was seen feeding the crows behind the hall, her presence causing mild consternation among attendees. No one had any details about her identity, save that she was small, pale, and strangely composed, as though perfectly content to be observed without observing in return. Letters to the editor debated the propriety of children in alleys, some calling for parental responsibility, others, rather touchingly, defending the child's innocence. Purbright read these with mild amusement, noting which correspondence had a penchant for drama and which for quiet exaggeration. Purbright's own inquiries began with a simple walk through the market. Mr. Bletchley, the baker, had already heard the story from 3 customers before breakfast, and insisted in the gravest tones that "it is unnatural, sir, unnatural, I tell you." Bletchley's wife, busy kneading dough, muttered under her breath that the child might have been sent by the school authorities to see what the town made of her. Purbright nodded politely, asking a few measured questions about the girl's appearance, which only confirmed what he had already observed. The child was tidy, quiet, and deliberate in her movements, as though each action were considered and controlled. In the library, Miss Trenchard, Flaxborough's archivist and occasional gossiping sage, recounted to Purbright the earliest references to the Havisham family. It seemed the child's presence was less surprising than the sheer continuity of local curiosity. The Havishams, she said, have a history of peculiar behaviour, always in minor scandal, never in actual harm. Her voice dropped to a confidential whisper. "It's in the blood, Inspector. Not dangerous, you understand, but odd. They do not conform." Purbright listened, noting that Miss Trenchard's emphasis on lineage and eccentricity was itself a kind of clue. People of long standing in Flaxborough often carried peculiarities like heirlooms, and the child was now another example. Meanwhile, the townsfolk in small clusters began to exchange stories embellished by imagination. Mr. Lovelace, a retired army major, claimed he had seen the child handling the birds as if conducting a miniature drill, precise and unnerving. Mrs. Bunting, whose opinion carried weight by virtue of knowing everyone's business, insisted she had overheard the child murmuring, "The crows know," which she interpreted, naturally, as a portent of criminal intent. Purbright, who passed Mrs. Bunting on his rounds, said nothing, noting only her animated expression and the slight twitch of her fingers, a habit she displayed whenever she was fabricating moral urgency. The first person Purbright felt compelled to speak with directly was the child herself. He did not rush. It was unnecessary. By mid-morning, He made his way to the alley, where she still lingered behind the hall, scattering crumbs to a now modest assembly of crows. They had evidently learned to anticipate her presence. "Good morning," he said quietly. The child looked up, acknowledging him with the same small, measured nod as before. "Do you often feed the crows?" he asked, standing at a polite distance. "They like bread," she replied simply. Her voice was calm, neither defensive nor inviting. "And your name?" Purbright prompted gently, though with the habitual reserve that accompanied all such questions. "Eloise." "Havisham," she said, pronouncing it clearly as though she had anticipated the inquiry. Purbright inclined his head. "And you live in Flaxborough?" She shook her head. "I live near the edge, in the lane by the woods." That was all she offered. Yet the precision, the brevity, and the absence of hesitation told Purbright more than an elaborate account might have. She was observant, accustomed to attention, but unafraid, qualities that in a small town often made one a pivot of curiosity and speculation. Later that afternoon, the town gossip network reached its peak at the weekly council meeting. The chairman, Mr. Fenwick, opened with the routine business, which was quickly overshadowed by a flurry of reports about the child. One councillor suggested that she be politely questioned by the authorities. Another, more cautious, wondered aloud whether she was, in fact, the daughter of a wandering performer. Purbright, sitting quietly in the back, made notes in his mind rather than on paper. There was nothing illegal here, yet the focus on her, amplified by human imagination, created a fertile ground for minor scandal. By evening, the missing brandy incident had faded, replaced by speculation on Eloise Havisham's motives. Tea rooms buzzed with conjecture. Why feed the crows? Was she lonely, mischievous, or simply eccentric? Purbright, walking past the village green, noted each theory and the subtle signs of tension between neighbours. Small-town ethics, he thought, were like the petals of a dahlia, tightly layered, delicate, yet capable of shedding unexpectedly and revealing the soil beneath. Before leaving the market square, Purbright paused to observe the alley once more. The child was gone, as expected, though a few scattered crumbs and an abandoned feather marked her presence. He bent slightly, picking up the feather between thumb and forefinger. It was a common black crow feather, yet in its stillness it suggested the meticulousness of the girl's afternoon, methodical, patient, almost ceremonial. Returning to his office, Purbright reflected on human nature in Flaxborough. A child feeding crows was trivial, almost absurd, yet the reactions it provoked revealed the texture of the town, its penchant for overstatement, its need for order, its delight in gentle scandal. He did not yet know whether Eloise Havisham would be involved in anything more serious, but he understood that the town's response, its gossip, judgment, and subtle observation, might itself precipitate events that were otherwise unlikely. As night fell, the street lamps cast their soft glow across empty pavements. The quiet of Flaxborough was restored externally, though internally, in its minds and parlours, the cogs of speculation turned. Purbright, sitting at his desk with a cup of tea, glanced once more at his mental notes: child unknown, motive uncertain, town in minor uproar. The puzzle was small but intricate, and he was in no hurry. In Flaxborough, even the smallest anomaly demanded patience, and Inspector Purbright, with his habitual civility and calm, was accustomed to waiting for the truth to present itself in its own deliberate time. The morning after the council meeting, Flaxborough's streets carried the faint residue of curiosity, like dew on cobblestones. Purbright set out on his rounds with the deliberate unhurriedness he cultivated as a habit and an instrument of observation. The town itself seemed to be waiting for a signal, though none had yet been given. Shopkeepers arranged their displays with an air of normalcy that belied their private speculations, and a few passers-by cast furtive glances toward the alley behind the village hall, as though expecting the child to appear again at any moment. Purbright began with Mr. Pettigrew, whose recovery of the missing bottle of brandy had earned him both relief and moral triumph. The accountant greeted him at his office door with the faintest trace of suspicion. "Inspector," he said, "I trust you're aware of the, peculiarities surrounding yesterday's flower show?" "I am," Purbright replied, inclining his head politely. "You recovered your property without incident?" "Yes, yes," Pettigrew said, waving a hand. "Though one cannot help but wonder how it went missing in the first place. Perhaps the child, though I am sure you do not suspect her of theft," Purbright prompted quietly, allowing the pause to stretch. Pettigrew flushed, realizing the question required no answer. Purbright noted the reaction, a subtle tightening of the lips and a shift of weight that spoke more than words. The man had a strong sense of propriety. Any suggestion of wrongdoing, however absurd, was uncomfortable. From there, Purbright moved to Mrs. Crayford, who was arranging her chrysanthemums in the back of the shop. She greeted him with a brisk nod and, without waiting for formalities, launched into an account of the child's behavior. Feeding crows, you understand, quite unnatural, and in public. One cannot ignore such things in a respectable town. People are talking, Inspector, talking at tea, at church, everywhere. Purbright allowed himself the smallest smile, noting the selective precision of her phrasing. He asked gentle questions, which Mrs. Crayford answered with a mixture of indignation and pride at being a moral authority. She mentioned the murmuring she thought she had overheard, the crows no, and Purbright filed the phrase away, not dismissing it outright, though its significance was yet uncertain. He then visited Miss Trenchard in the library. Unlike Mrs. Crayford, Miss Trenchard's observations were careful, almost archival in nature. She supplied him with background, the child's family history, a lineage notable for eccentricity, and minor incidents that had, over decades, irritated the more conventional townsfolk without ever rising to true scandal. "It is not malice, Inspector," she said softly, "simply a habit of being different. The Havishams have always been a little outside the ordinary pattern. One might almost say they observe the town as much as it observes them." Purbright made no immediate comment. He liked such assessments, particularly when couched in terms of family tradition, for they often revealed the deeper logic of human behavior in a small town. Those who seemed extraordinary on the surface often conformed in unexpected ways once the underlying pattern was understood. Returning toward the high street, he encountered Mr. Lovelace, the retired army major, who insisted on demonstrating the child's supposed crow drill in the alley. Purbright allowed the performance, listening politely, as the man recounted precise movements, the angle of hand gestures, the timing of her steps. It was clear to Purbright that the majesty of imagination was at work. Mr. Lovelace's account was more military pageant than casual feeding of birds. Still, the consistency of description, repeated independently by multiple witnesses, made the event worthy of note. By mid-morning, Purbright had compiled a list of persons to question further: Mr. Pettigrew, for his temperamental sense of propriety, Mrs. Crayford for her moral vigilance, Miss Trenchard for historical context, and the child herself for direct observation. He also decided to approach the hall's caretaker, Mr. Jowett, whose practical eye might have caught details unnoticed by the morally engaged or historically minded. Jowett, a man of few words and slow gestures, spoke of the child with quiet precision, "She did nothing wrong, Inspector, but she left a mess of crumbs. Crows will be back again, you mark my words." And one of the bins tipped over. Not deliberate, I don't think, just careless. Purbright noted the absence of moral judgment. It was the pragmatism that mattered here, the tangible effects, rather than the imagined one. By the afternoon, Purbright arranged to speak with Eloise Havisham once more. He found her at the alley, crouched in the familiar position among the crows, as though she had been expecting him. He spoke quietly, observing her expressions, the tilt of her head, the ease with which she managed the birds. "Eloise," he said, "do you know all the people in Flaxborough?" She looked up, eyes steady. "No." "Yet you seem to know exactly how to feed the crows," he remarked. "They are careful," she said. "I watch them." "Do they tell you secrets?" Purbright inquired, keeping his tone entirely neutral. "They tell each other," she replied. "Not me." The simplicity of her answer was revealing. She was quiet, controlled, and precise. There was no pretense, yet no naivety. Purbright made another note, silently noting that children who spoke carefully often concealed more than they revealed. Later, walking back along the lane toward his office, Purbright reflected on the accounts he had gathered. Each observer added a layer, sometimes contradictory, often revealing more about the teller than the subject. The townsfolk were excellent witnesses to human curiosity, imperfect in observation, and vulnerable to embellishment. The child, meanwhile, remained a study in controlled anomaly, visible yet apart from the social order, neither inviting nor resisting scrutiny. By evening, the town's conversation had turned from mere curiosity to gentle suspicion. Mrs. Bunting, who rarely missed a moment of moral oversight, was suggesting that Eloise might be sent for a purpose, though she could not say what, and Mr. Pettigrew was quietly reassessing the loss of his brandy in light of this mysterious visitor. Purbright sipped his tea and made mental notes. It was precisely these minor disturbances, these small irregularities, that held the key to understanding the unfolding situation. Crime in Flaxborough was rarely dramatic. It moved in whispers, in glances, in minor adjustments of behavior, and Purbright understood that his role was not to rush to judgment, but to allow the pieces to arrange themselves until the pattern became visible. Before retiring to his office, he walked once more past the alley. It was empty, save for a scattering of crumbs and the faint shadow of a crow's wing against the wall. The child was gone, but her presence lingered in subtle shifts. The tilt of a gate, a disturbed leaf, the careful arrangement of dust on the cobblestones, small, precise, meaningful. Purbright noted it all, knowing that in Flaxborough even minor signs were seldom meaningless. By the time he returned to his desk, the day had settled into the familiar quiet of early evening. Outside, the street lamps threw long reflections. Across polished windows, and the town's collective attention drifted elsewhere. Purbright, however, understood that the most interesting observation was the town itself, its fascination, its moral choreography, its readiness to manufacture patterns where none existed. And in this he saw the framework of the next stage of his inquiries. Tomorrow he would begin to ask questions more pointedly, observe more closely, and probe the seemingly inconsequential details that the townsfolk dismissed. The child, the crows, the scattered crumbs, and the reactions of a town unaccustomed to disorder formed the first layer of a subtle puzzle. Patience, as always, would be his ally. For now, the quiet of Flaxborough remained undisturbed externally, but within its parlours, offices, and tea-rooms, a small tremor had begun. Purbright made a note to himself. Curiosity and coincidence often collided in patterns that only a careful observer could untangle. and he would wait with quiet civility until the pattern revealed itself. By midweek, Flaxborough had largely resumed its habitual rhythm, though the ripple of curiosity surrounding Eloise Havisham persisted in quieter, more insistent undertones. Tea rooms whispered, shutters were discreetly peered through, and the local butcher, a man not prone to flights of fancy, found himself noting that girl's eyes as he handed over sausages. It was the sort of observation that in a town like Flaxborough carried significance far beyond the act itself, a reminder that nothing remained entirely private, not even a child quietly feeding crows. Purbright, meanwhile, approached the situation with his customary patience. The town's mild panic over the flower show and the missing brandy had mostly subsided, replaced by something subtler: the search for a neat explanation. Flaxborough, like most small towns, craved closure, and the local constables were not slow to oblige. Inspector Cripps, a punctual man of keen practicality but limited imagination, was the first to suggest an obvious resolution. He called upon Purbright in the morning, reporting that the child had been identified by a passing postman as Eloise Havisham, daughter of a widow living in the lane near the woods. Cripps's deduction was rapid and precise. The child had wandered, the crows were fed, the brandy had gone missing, and the entire commotion could be laid squarely on her shoulders, or so he assumed. Purbright listened politely, his expression composed and neutral. "And what exactly makes you suspect her of mischief?" he asked quietly. "Well," Cripps said, tapping a ledger for emphasis, "the crows, the alley, the unattended brandy. She was seen nearby at the same time. A tidy coincidence, if—" "You ask me?" Purbright inclined his head. The logic was neat, persuasive even to an untrained eye, yet he withheld judgment. Coincidences occurred in Flaxborough, and small children had a remarkable knack for timing. Furthermore, the postman's certainty, like much of Flaxborough's testimony, was filtered through hearsay and expectation rather than observation. Still, the idea of a first, obvious suspect gained traction among those eager for resolution. Word of the deduction spread quickly. Mrs. Crayford, ever alert to moral breaches, was ready to condemn Eloise outright, though she phrased her objections delicately. "I would never suggest malice, Inspector," she said to Purbright, "but perhaps she ought to be watched." Mr. Pettigrew, though less theatrical, murmured that it was not impossible that the girl had moved the brandy, though he admitted he had no evidence beyond seeing her near the alley. Even Miss Trenchard, whose historical patience usually tempered judgment, conceded that Flaxborough's curiosity might be justified. Purbright chose a measured approach. He did not dispute the suspicion directly, but he spent the day observing rather than accusing. He visited the alley, noting that it was empty and quiet, save for a few displaced crumbs and a single black feather that trembled in the morning breeze. The residue of Eloise's presence remained, but there was nothing tangible linking her to the missing brandy or any impropriety. It was, as he suspected, an overreach of inference rather than fact. Still, the appearance of a first suspect altered the town's behavior. Shopkeepers began to watch the lane more closely, noting anyone who might be Eloise or someone resembling her. Parents murmured caution to their children, warning them not to provoke the birds. Even the crows themselves seemed aware of the new tension. Their calls were sharper, more urgent, as if acknowledging the town's growing scrutiny. Purbright next spoke with the child. He found her in the same crouched position behind the hall, feeding the birds with deliberate patience. He seated himself on a nearby step, keeping his distance, and observed the quiet ritual. "Eloise," he said gently, "there are people in town who think you may have moved something that did not belong to you." She looked up, eyes steady, unafraid. "I did not," she said simply. "And you have no idea what happened to the missing brandy?" "No," she replied. Her hands continued their careful scattering of crumbs. "The crows do not take such things," Purbright allowed, silence to settle, watching the rhythm of her movements, the calm precision with which she handled the birds. Children who spoke with such deliberation often concealed layers of observation and understanding beyond their apparent years. He noted the absence of hesitation, the refusal to evade, the clarity of denial. Each element reinforced the idea that the child was unlikely to have acted with the kind of mischief the town imagined. By mid-afternoon, the town's collective attention had shifted to a new theatre, the local allotments. A dispute had erupted between two gardeners over the precise measurement of plot boundaries and the alleged encroachment of beans. Mrs. Bunting, who had found her own excitement waning, was quick to suggest that Eloise Havisham might be involved, though there was no logical connection, save that the child had been seen near the hall, and thus could plausibly be anywhere. Flaxborough's imagination, once sparked, was not easily restrained. Purbright took careful note of the expansion of suspicion. It was precisely this pattern, where an initial, neat solution overshadowed uncertainty, that demanded scrutiny. A first suspect was convenient but rarely correct. Patterns in small towns were rarely linear. Coincidences multiplied when interpreted through the lens of expectation. The evening brought another opportunity. Purbright called upon Mr. Jowett, the hall's caretaker, whose practical eye often caught details that others missed. Jowett pointed out the subtle displacement of chairs and the slight scuff marks near the storage cupboard. "Nothing alarming," he said, "but someone was near here, moving about. Could be anyone, really. Could have been the postman, the council clerk, even one of the children. The point is, someone disturbed things." Purbright noted the practical observation. There were disturbances, yes, but their origin was unknown. The neat attribution to Eloise remained unsubstantiated. He made a mental list of all who had the opportunity, their motives and their proximity, recognizing the importance of timing, movement, and human attention to detail over the assumptions that the townsfolk preferred. Later, Purbright returned to his office, reflecting on the town's eagerness for closure. The pattern of accusation was simple and attractive. Child seen, near event, minor mystery unresolved, quick attribution of responsibility. Yet, as always, he knew that human motives in Flaxborough were layered, subtle, and often hidden beneath polite behavior and public decorum. The first obvious suspect was convenient, but, in his experience, unlikely to be accurate. By nightfall, the alleys were empty, the streets quiet, but the small tremor of unease lingered. The town had identified a villain, if only imaginatively, and the gears of gossip would continue to turn. Purbright, sipping a cup of tea, considered the next stage. Small towns required patience, careful observation, and the willingness to let human behavior reveal itself. The child had not acted with malice, he concluded, yet her presence had catalyzed a pattern of suspicion that, unchecked, could cause subtle chaos. Tomorrow he would pursue subtler inquiries, speak to more witnesses, and follow the odd details others overlooked. The missing brandy, the displaced chairs, the black feather, all were threads in a pattern yet to be revealed. Flaxborough slept, untroubled outwardly, but quietly restless in its interior life. Purbright, calm, composed and patient, knew that the first suspect was rarely the answer. He would wait, observe, and guide events gently, allowing the truth to surface in its own deliberate time. The crows had not yet gone to roost, nor had the story found its resolution, and in this the inspector took quiet satisfaction. The following morning, Flaxborough awoke to the familiar rhythm of market carts and the distant clatter of the railway station. though a subtle undercurrent of curiosity persisted from the flower show. Purbright began his day with a quiet walk through the town, as much to observe the human patterns as to enjoy the early warmth of spring. The cobblestones were damp with overnight dew, and the faint scent of baking bread mingled with the lingering perfume of the daisies in the hall. Nothing appeared unusual, yet his instincts, honed over years of small-town subtleties, suggested otherwise. It was on the way to the library that Purbright noticed the first trivial but odd detail. A small scrap of paper lay near the steps of the alley behind the hall, half covered in dirt and morning rain. He picked it up carefully. On it was a hastily drawn sketch, a single crow outlined in charcoal with an arrow pointing to a nearby bin. There was no signature, no words, only the image. Purbright examined it closely. The sketch was rudimentary, yet the arrow was deliberate. He had no immediate understanding of its origin, nor whether it was connected to Eloise or the previous day's minor disturbances. Still, it was precisely the sort of anomaly that required attention. Small towns, he knew, often concealed signals in the mundane, a mislaid object, an overheard remark, or a sketch forgotten in haste. He pocketed it, careful not to disturb the surroundings further. His first stop was the library, where Miss Trenchard was already arranging a display of local manuscripts. He placed the scrap on her desk. "Found this," he said, allowing the silence to stretch while she examined it. Miss Trenchard leaned forward, frowning slightly. "Curious. Very deliberate, isn't it? Not the casual doodle of a child, though perhaps intended for a child." "Perhaps," Purbright said softly. "I intend to keep it in mind. One never knows how minor signs connect to human behavior." From the library, he walked through the market square. Shopkeepers were busy arranging produce, but several glanced up with faintly knowing expressions, as though expecting him to comment on the child or the unfolding gossip. Mr. Bletchley, the baker, observed him with particular interest, noting the small scrap of paper Purbright carried. "Bit of mischief?" Bletchley asked, half joking. "Or a warning?" "Perhaps neither," Purbright replied, letting the possibility linger. He noted the baker's reaction, curiosity tinged with moral speculation. Small towns thrived on such reactions, and each one was a clue in its own way. By mid-morning, Purbright returned to the alley behind the hall, determined to examine more carefully the space Eloise had occupied. The crows had not yet arrived, but the subtle displacement of rubbish bins, the small scuff marks in the soil, and a single black feather all suggested movement, deliberate, controlled, and patient. He crouched to inspect a slight indentation near the cobblestones, barely noticeable, as though someone had knelt with care, returning precisely to the same position each time. The attention to detail fascinated him. The precision of habit often concealed intentions that were otherwise invisible. It was during this quiet examination that Mr. Jowett, the hall's caretaker, approached. He had a practical eye and a quiet patience that complemented Purbright's observational style. "Noticed something, sir?" Jowett asked, nodding toward the feather. "A few things," Purbright said, tapping his chin thoughtfully. "The child's presence here is deliberate, predictable, and precise. The crows, the crumbs, even the placement of her body leave subtle traces. Someone else left a note, a sketch. That complicates things." Jowett nodded, considering the implications. "Could be a neighbor or another child. They do sometimes leave little signals, not uncommon in Flaxborough." Purbright allowed a brief, quiet smile. Flaxborough's eccentricities were small but intricate, and he found the puzzle in such minor details both satisfying and revealing. By lunchtime he had compiled a list of people who might shed light on the odd scrap. Eloise herself, the postman who had first spotted her, and any local children who might have access to the hall's rear alley. He made a deliberate choice to begin with the least likely, not because he doubted the child, but because observing reactions often revealed truths the facts alone could not. Returning to the lane near the woods, Purbright found Eloise tending to a small garden, a modest plot carefully arranged with neat rows of seedlings. She greeted him with a quiet nod, as always, neither inviting nor resisting conversation. "I have something to show you," he said, producing the sketch. Eloise examined it closely, her small fingers tracing the charcoal arrow. She did not speak. Immediately, after a measured pause, she said, "I did not draw this." "Do you know who might have?" Purbright asked. She shook her head. "Perhaps another child, I do not know." He allowed silence to settle. Her honesty was precise and deliberate. She neither volunteered extraneous information nor concealed obvious facts. Such clarity was rare, and it suggested a mind attentive to truth, however minor the matters at hand. By mid-afternoon, Purbright returned to the town centre, noting how the minor detail, the sketch, had begun to stir gossip. Mrs. Bunting, who had been silent since the council meeting, insisted that someone was deliberately provoking the town. "Signs, symbols," she whispered to Mrs. Crayford. "Something is being suggested." Purbright observed the exchange with quiet amusement. Small towns, he reflected, had a tendency to create drama from the smallest spark, particularly when moral narratives were involved. Each interpretation added layers of complication, obscuring simple truths beneath a haze of conjecture. Later, at the village hall, he interviewed Mr. Jowett more formally. The caretaker admitted that he had noticed minor movements of bins and chairs in the alley, though he had attributed them to cleaning routines. He had not seen anyone leave a sketch, nor had he heard anything unusual. Yet the subtle shifts in arrangement, the slight dusting of crumbs, and the disturbed positions of crows' roosting spots suggested that someone had been there deliberately, at times when the hall was ostensibly empty. Purbright made a careful note. The trivial, odd detail, the sketch, was not directly incriminating, yet it was meaningful. In small-town human behavior, such anomalies often signaled intention. A seemingly minor object could reveal far more than a public accusation. By evening, the town's attention had splintered. Some were still focused on the child, others on the missing brandy, and a few on imagined provocations, such as the sketch. Purbright, however, considered the entire pattern calmly. Human behavior in Flaxborough moved in observable rhythms, subtle cues, and predictable reactions. One could trace intention and observation not in dramatic events, but in minor gestures, overlooked objects, and small, consistent habits. Returning to his office, Purbright reviewed his notes. The scrap of paper, the feather, the crumbs, and Eloise's patient handling of the crows formed a web of minor but telling details. Each alone was insignificant. Together they suggested order, observation, and the deliberate interplay of attention. He poured a cup of tea and watched the street from his window. The lamp-posts cast long reflections on the cobblestones, and shadows of the trees from the lane reached across the market square. The trivial but odd detail, the sketch, had begun to shift his focus, quietly undermining assumptions, hinting that there were layers to the situation that the town's first obvious suspect had not accounted for. Purbright knew that tomorrow he would need to expand his inquiries, speak with new witnesses, and follow the subtle currents stirred by these minor anomalies. For in Flaxborough the truth often revealed itself not in loud proclamations but in the softest of traces, a feather, a crumb, a hastily drawn arrow, and the patient, deliberate observation of those who knew how to look. And in this, as always, patience was the key. The morning was mist-laden when Purbright set out to expand the field of inquiry. Flaxborough seemed to have returned to normal, yet the residue of the previous week's disturbances persisted in subtle ways. Shopkeepers were slightly more vigilant, the postman lingered longer on his rounds, and the occasional black feather was still spotted along the edges of the cobbles. Small towns, Purbright reflected, rarely forgot the presence of novelty, and even less so when it intersected with the town's taste for order and propriety. He began with the local school, where children often carried rumours faster than adults and observed behaviour with unfiltered honesty. The headmistress, Miss Carroway, received him with cordial precision, her eyes noting his every movement as though measuring his patience against the standards of her own schoolroom. "Inspector," she said, "I believe some of our pupils may have seen the child near the alley yesterday. It is not unusual for them to wander after school, though of course we discourage it." Purbright nodded. "Would you mind if I spoke with a few of them quietly?" She hesitated briefly, then agreed. A handful of children were gathered in a corner, careful to whisper in tones of measured curiosity. They had seen the child feed the crows, yes, and had noticed the sketch on the ground, though each version varied slightly. Some insisted they had seen a second figure crouched in the shadows. Others swore the arrows pointed not to the bin, but toward the hedge at the far end of the alley. Purbright made no comment, simply observing their mannerisms and the consistency or inconsistency of their accounts. Children, he knew, often revealed truth by the way they hesitated, the precision of their recall, or the emphasis they placed on certain elements. And the discrepancies, though minor, were themselves clues. The sketch might have been moved, adjusted, or even replaced deliberately or accidentally. By late morning, Purbright moved toward the high street, noting the subtle signs of tension in the town. Mrs. Crayford was watering her chrysanthemums, keeping one eye on a passing neighbour, while Mr. Pettigrew adjusted the lace curtains in his shop front as though to signal order and propriety. Each minor act, though unremarkable in isolation, formed part of a larger pattern of observation and response. He stopped at the post office, where the postman confirmed his earlier report. Eloise Havisham had indeed been seen near the hall, but a second figure, a young man unknown to the staff, had been spotted passing the alley at roughly the same time. Purbright noted the description: average height, dark coat, carrying a small parcel. Nothing suspicious in itself, but in combination with the sketch and minor disturbances, it suggested a broader field of potential participants than the town had yet acknowledged. Next, Purbright visited the local apothecary, Mr. Hammond, whose meticulous eye for detail often revealed more than casual observation. Hammond noted a small smear of black soot on the rear steps of the hall, which he suggested could have come from a displaced candle or a smoker's match. Purbright considered this quietly. Small as it was, the soot indicated movement, presence, and perhaps attention to the environment, something he would bear in mind as the investigation widened. By early afternoon, Purbright had gathered enough minor, intersecting observations to begin mapping connections. The children's accounts, the postman's second figure, the sketch, and the soot all hinted at multiple actors, some overlapping with Eloise's presence, others distinct. He realized the neat story of a single, obvious suspect no longer held. Flaxborough, in its desire for tidy narratives, was already unsettled by this revelation. Returning to the alley, Purbright found Mr. Jowett there, busy arranging the bins and sweeping leaves. The caretaker noted that he had observed fresh disturbances. Overnight, small footprints in damp soil, a displaced garden tool, and faint marks on the cobbles suggesting careful handling of objects. Purbright inspected each with meticulous attention. The footprints were small but not identical to Eloise's, and the marks on the cobbles were deliberate, suggesting someone who understood how to leave minimal traces while still moving objects. Made a mental note, the second figure was real, deliberate, and competent in navigating the small but observant space behind the hall. The trivial oddities, the sketch, the feather, the crumbs, the soot, the footprints, were all pieces of a puzzle whose scale had just expanded. By late afternoon, Purbright visited Mr. Lovelace, the retired army major, who had previously offered his theatrical account of the crow drill. Lovelace was eager to contribute further details. "I noticed," he said, leaning on his cane, "that the child often watches others more than she allows herself to be watched. But yesterday someone else appeared at the periphery, briefly, as if to test her reactions. I cannot say who, but—" They moved deliberately and were gone before I could get closer. Purbright filed this carefully. Lovelace's military lens made even minor details appear significant, and in this case it reinforced the notion that someone had entered the space with attention and purpose, interacting with the environment in ways unnoticed by most. On his way back, Purbright noted the subtle changes in the town's rhythm. The local baker, the grocer, and the station master all glanced toward the alley with mild apprehension. Gossip was beginning to widen beyond. The child, extending tentatively toward the unknown visitor, described by the postman and observed by Lovelace. The neat attribution of responsibility to Eloise was losing traction, replaced by a more diffuse uncertainty. By evening, Purbright returned to his office, reviewing his notes, the sketch, the crumbs, the feather, the soot, the displaced bins, the small footprints, the second figure. Each alone was minor, inconsequential even, yet together they formed a pattern that could no longer be ignored. The town, he reflected, would cling to the simplest narrative for as long as it could, but subtle evidence rarely followed the dictates of convenience. He made a deliberate decision to speak with Eloise once more, not for confrontation, but for observation. She was crouched in her familiar spot behind the hall, crows assembled and awaiting their accustomed crumbs. She greeted him with quiet acknowledgement, continuing her careful work. "I've observed some new signs," Purbright said. "Footprints, marks, even a second figure seen yesterday. Do you know anything about these?" She shook her head. "No, only the crows, only me." Purbright allowed the silence to settle, noting her precise language, the absence of hesitation, the clarity of denial. She was not evasive, nor was she naive. Her observations were strictly her own, yet they aligned with his growing sense that the first obvious suspect was not the sole actor in this minor drama. By nightfall the town slept, but Purbright remained at his desk, quietly arranging his observations. The field had expanded, revealing multiple actors, subtle movements, and overlapping intentions. He knew that the next steps would require careful interviewing, deliberate probing, and patient attention to the reactions of both child and adults. In Flaxborough, small towns often believed that order could be restored by simple attribution. Purbright knew better. Human behavior, observation, and intention were rarely tidy, and in the quiet spaces behind the hall, the town's assumptions were already beginning to unravel. The real story, he suspected, was about to widen beyond the first obvious suspect, threading through the subtle acts of multiple individuals, each with their own small motivations and concealed purposes. And for an inspector accustomed to patience, this expansion of the field was precisely the sort of subtle challenge that brought quiet satisfaction. Flaxborough woke to a brisk wind that rattled shutters and scattered the last of the morning mist across the cobblestones. For Purbright, the day promised little in the way of drama, yet the subtle tensions of the past week had left a quiet undercurrent in the town's pulse. He began his morning with a walk toward the village hall, curious to observe whether any of the small disturbances, crumbs, feathers, sketches, had persisted overnight. The alley was quiet, but not untouched. A new cluster of feathers lay near the rear wall, larger and darker than before, and a fresh scattering of crumbs suggested someone had repeated the feeding ritual, though Purbright could not determine whether it was Eloise or another actor. It was the sort of trivial repetition that might be overlooked by casual observers, but could, with careful attention, reveal patterns of habit and intent. He had barely straightened from examining the alley when Mrs. Bunting emerged from her corner, shop visibly flustered.
"Inspector, you must come quickly," she called, her voice a mix of urgency and moral alarm. Purbright followed, noting the shift in her expression. The quiet precision of a woman who had measured events for years, now unsettled. The source
of her concern was the local bakery, where Mr. Bletchley, the usually composed proprietor, was waving an overturned flour sack and demonstrating in urgent gestures that someone, or several someones, had been inside during the night. Purbright entered the shop, noting the subtle chaos: flour tracked in delicate patterns across the floor, the till untouched but slightly ajar, and a small stool knocked over near the rear window. "Good morning, Inspector," Bletchley said, in a tone that combined irritation with incredulity. "I came in to open, and I find this. No one forced a window, no sign of entry by normal means. Yet someone has been here, moving, testing perhaps. And look, crumbs." He gestured to a faint trail leading from the window to the alley. Purbright crouched to examine the trail. Indeed, the crumbs seemed carefully placed, almost deliberately, as though marking a path. The precision was remarkable, small, evenly spaced, leading toward the hall's rear entrance. Nothing suggested theft, nothing seemed chaotic. Yet the deliberate nature of the marks suggested intention. "Have you seen anyone suspicious?" Purbright asked, his voice low and measured. "Not a soul," Bletchley replied. "Only the wind, or perhaps a child. Though by God, Inspector, I cannot imagine it would take such care to make a mess." Purbright allowed the quiet to settle. The careful dispersal of flour, the precision of the crumbs, the undisturbed till, all hinted at a presence both cautious and deliberate. It was not an ordinary intrusion. Later he returned to the alley to examine the end point of the crumb trail, noting a second sketch pinned to the hall door with a small pebble. It depicted two figures, one small, crouched with birds around her, the second larger, standing nearby with an outstretched hand. The arrow this time pointed from the standing figure toward the child. The sketch was more precise than the first, suggesting familiarity with both figures and the space. Purbright made a mental note. The minor oddities had coalesced into a new, significant incident. The second sketch, combined with the bakery intrusion and the deliberate crumbs, implied deliberate orchestration rather than coincidence. By mid-morning, he interviewed Mr. Jowett, who confirmed noticing the fresh flower patterns and the trail leading toward the hall. "I thought it might be Eloise again, sir," Jowett said, shrugging. "But these marks, they are different. She would not be so theatrical." "Different how?" Purbright asked. "Careful, measured," Jowett replied, almost like someone trying to tell a story. Purbright nodded silently. Indeed, the progression of minor details suggested intention layered with subtle communication. Small towns rarely witnessed messages conveyed in such understated forms. Flaxborough was no exception. In the afternoon, he spoke with Miss Trenchard, who had examined the sketch and crumbs. She observed that the second figure might not be human, perhaps a symbolic addition, though unlikely. Purbright agreed that the representation was stylized but carefully proportioned, likely someone's interpretation of actual presence. The child alone could not have created such a deliberate narrative. He then visited Mr. Lovelace, the retired major who was intrigued by the bakery incident. "A second figure," Lovelace said, moving with intent, carefully, without leaving the usual chaos. "A test, perhaps, or a challenge?" He gestured dramatically as though illustrating a military maneuver. Purbright recorded the comment quietly. Lovelace's military lens amplified minor details, yet it highlighted the consistent observation, deliberate movement, minimal traces, and orchestrated presence. Returning to the hall, Purbright noted the reactions of townsfolk. Whispers of ghosts, mischief-makers, and children's pranks circulated, though none connected the incidents directly. The bakery intrusion and the alley sketches were separated by time and space, yet a subtle narrative linked them. Human behavior, when observed patiently, revealed intention even in the absence of words. By late afternoon, he spoke again with
Eloise. She was crouched among the crows, still precise in her movements, quiet and observant. "There's been another incident today," Purbright said, producing the second sketch.
"Do you know who placed this?" "No," she replied. Her calm, measured voice contrasted sharply with the town's growing agitation. "Not me. Only the crows, only me feeding them." "And the crumbs in the bakery?" Purbright asked gently. She shook her head. "Not me. I do not go there at night." Her clarity and composure reinforced what he had already begun to suspect. The first obvious suspect remained innocent of deliberate wrongdoing, and yet someone else had introduced a new variable. By evening, the town's quiet unease deepened. Shopkeepers were more vigilant, and the postman lingered near the hall, noting shadows and movements. Gossip had begun to merge the separate incidents into a single narrative, though the details remained inconsistent. Purbright, reviewing the day's observations, noted that the second incident had shifted suspicion away from Eloise and toward an unknown presence, someone careful, patient, and observant, capable of leaving deliberate minor traces without committing overt mischief. He returned to his office, assembling the day's notes: flour, crumbs, footprints, feathers, and sketches. Each alone was trivial, but together they formed a subtle communication, a chain of events that required patient interpretation. The town, eager for a tidy resolution, was unlikely to perceive the layered intentions. As darkness fell over Flaxborough, Purbright contemplated the day's revelations. The pattern of behavior was no longer confined to a single, obvious suspect. A second actor had emerged, quietly manipulating the environment and testing the responses of both child and townsfolk. Small towns, he reflected, rarely witnessed such careful orchestration, and the human tendencies for embellishment and assumption only obscured the underlying truth. For Purbright, the task was clear. Observe patiently, catalogue minor details, and follow the subtle trail of intention. The second incident had shifted the investigation, introducing complexity and nuance, but it also offered new opportunities for deduction. The town's desire for closure would persist, but the true narrative required careful, deliberate unraveling. Outside, the crows stirred in their roosts, responding to the fading light. Within the quiet of the hall and the alleys, the evidence of subtle human design lay scattered like breadcrumbs, waiting for the patient eye to follow it to its source. Purbright sipped his tea and reviewed his notes once more. Tomorrow, he would return to interviews, follow the paths suggested by the new sketches, and seek the subtle inconsistencies in human behavior that so often revealed the truth in Flaxborough. The first obvious suspect was no longer sufficient. The town's quiet equilibrium had been disturbed, and the pattern was unfolding in ways that demanded careful attention, observation, and patience. The night settled, calm externally but charged, with subtle tensions. The second incident had shifted the narrative, and Purbright, serene yet alert, understood that the next stage of his inquiry would require him to probe deeper into the intentions, habits, and interactions of both child
and townsfolk.
The solution was no longer simple, but the trail remained visible to the careful observer. The following morning, Purbright rose before the town stirred. The streets of Flaxborough were still quiet, and the faint smell of wet cobbles mingled with the lingering scent of early baked bread from the bakery. With a thermos of tea in hand, he settled at his office window, reviewing the accumulated details: the crows, the crumbs, the black feathers, the sketches, the flower trail, and the subtle footprints. Each seemed trivial in isolation, yet together they wove a pattern that demanded careful reflection. He considered human nature, as he often did in moments of quiet. Flaxborough's citizens were polite, measured, and superficially orderly, yet beneath the outward calm lay small rivalries, petty grievances, and unspoken resentments. The first obvious suspect, the child, had acted with innocence, yet her presence had highlighted the town's latent readiness to assign blame. The second incident, by contrast, hinted at deliberate orchestration, someone testing the town, its observers, and perhaps even Eloise herself. Purbright's reflections turned to the psychology of small towns. Here, attention to minor details often became a form of social currency. A misplaced chair, a feather, or a crumb was enough to spark gossip, fuel speculation, and subtly influence reputations. The town's morality operated through observation rather than legislation, and its citizens often judged by mannerisms rather than facts. In such an environment, careful human behavior revealed intentions more reliably than words or overt actions. He sipped his tea and turned his thoughts to the child. Eloise Havisham, patient and deliberate, had maintained a clarity that few adults could achieve. She had been truthful about her own actions while not speculating about others. Her honesty was remarkable, yet it did not explain the second figure, the sketches, or the flower trail. Someone else was active, and the subtlety of that person's movements suggested a mind both precise and observant, capable of manipulating the environment without drawing overt attention. Purbright reviewed the sketches once more. The first had been a simple crow, the second a depiction of two figures with an arrow pointing from the standing figure to the crouched child. There was an implicit narrative, almost a gentle instruction, but one that was not immediately threatening. Yet the combination of the sketches and the physical traces, the crumbs, the soot, the small footprints, implied deliberate testing of the town's reactions. He recalled the reports from the children at the school, the observations of Mr. Lovelace, Mr. Jowett's practical assessments, and the postman's second figure. Each added nuance, and the inconsistencies between accounts were not contradictions, but clues. They revealed selective observation, exaggeration, and the prioritization of what each witness deemed significant. Human perception, he reminded himself, was itself a medium of evidence. Purbright waited a few moments before following at a discreet distance. He did not intend confrontation yet. Observation was the priority. The figure passed the bakery, casting a quick glance inside before continuing toward the high street, where shop windows reflected a ghostly image of movement. It was clear that this person was familiar with the town's rhythms and attentive to the presence of others. The careful avoidance of public notice suggested experience and patience, hallmarks of a mind accustomed to subtle influence. Later, Purbright called upon Mr. Jowett, sharing his observations and soliciting insight. "The individual moves with precision," he said. "Not clumsy, not hurried, yet clearly testing boundaries. What can you tell me about potential townsfolk who exhibit such traits? Jowett considered carefully. There are a few, sir. People who value observation and subtle control. Someone accustomed to understanding small details, who watches others while remaining unseen. Mr. Lovelace, certainly, though he has been under close observation himself. Miss Trenchard, perhaps, though she is more cerebral than tactile. And others. The new clerk at the post office, recently transferred, moves quietly and notices everything. Purbright nodded. He did not exclude anyone, but he catalogued these traits carefully: patience, subtlety, deliberate testing of the environment, attention to human reactions, and a measured interaction with objects and space. These were the markers of his hidden actor. By midday, he visited the bakery, ostensibly, to discuss flour orders with Mr. Bletchley. While chatting politely, he observed reactions, noting how the baker positioned his body, how his hands lingered near the register, and how he glanced toward the alley and the rear entrance. Each movement was slight, almost imperceptible, yet collectively they formed a web of attentiveness that could not be ignored. Purbright made careful mental notes, resisting the urge to voice suspicion, for the real test would be subtle. A gentle question, a staged observation, an invitation to reveal intent without accusation. Returning to the hall, Purbright spent time with Eloise, casually asking questions about her routine, the placement of the crows, and her awareness of other children or visitors. Her responses were consistent and precise, revealing both honesty and a disciplined attention to her own patterns. She did not hint at knowledge of the second actor, yet her behavior indirectly confirmed the presence of an external influence. The careful choreography of the flour, crumbs, and sketches could not have arisen spontaneously. By late afternoon, he staged a second minor test. He rearranged the bins in the alley slightly differently, pinned a fresh sketch in an inconspicuous spot, and scattered a few crumbs in a pattern deliberately divergent from the prior arrangements. Then he retreated to an upstairs window, observing the alley and nearby streets with quiet patience. It did not take long for the hidden actor to respond. A figure approached cautiously, moving deliberately past the new sketch, tilting the head as though assessing changes. The bins were examined, a subtle adjustment made, and the individual paused briefly before retreating into the side lane. Purbright's careful observation confirmed what he had suspected. The person responded to environmental cues, reacted to minor interventions, and acted with attention and precision, yet avoided confrontation or obvious recognition. That evening, Purbright reflected on the day's results. The test had confirmed the presence of someone attentive, patient, and deliberately interactive with the town's microcosm. The second actor was real, methodical, and capable of subtle orchestration without detection. Importantly, they had shown awareness of his own minor interventions, suggesting intelligence and attentiveness beyond casual mischief. He reviewed the list of possible suspects, considering traits, habits, and access to locations. Each candidate was evaluated not for motive alone, but for behavioral consistency with observed actions, subtlety, patience, and deliberate engagement with minor environmental cues. The patterns were clear. The town had been quietly observed, tested, and gently manipulated, with Eloise as an unwitting participant rather than the orchestrator. By late evening, Purbright took a final walk through the market square, observing the townsfolk returning home, children playing quietly, and shopkeepers finishing their day's tasks. The town appeared calm, but beneath the surface, the minor disturbances had shifted attention and subtly tested assumptions. Small towns, he reflected, were both observant and vulnerable. The smallest interventions could ripple through social consciousness, and the hidden actor had exploited this with remarkable subtlety. Purbright returned to his office, cataloguing his notes sketches, observations, and reflections. The test had yielded confirmation, narrowing possibilities and highlighting the behavioral markers of the individual responsible for the second incident. He knew the next steps would involve careful, direct questioning, a polite, deliberate probe designed to elicit reaction and reveal truth without confrontation or alarm. The night settled over Flaxborough, the crows roosting quietly, the alley calm, and the town's residents unaware of the subtle narrative unfolding around them. Purbright, calm and patient, prepared for the next stage, a careful test of the hidden actor, one that would draw them out through observation, behavior, and the understated precision for which the town was now an unwitting stage. He sipped his tea, allowing satisfaction to settle quietly alongside anticipation. The pattern was nearly complete. The final revelations would require only a gentle, polite prod to uncover what patient observation had already revealed. The following morning brought a calmness that belied the subtle tension underlying Flaxborough's quiet streets. Purbright moved through the town with measured steps, observing the normal rhythm of shopkeepers preparing for business, children lingering near the schoolyard, and postmen adjusting their rounds with habitual precision. There was a faint sense of expectancy in the air, unspoken but perceptible to those attuned to minor irregularities. For Purbright, the day was dedicated not to pursuit, but to resolution, the careful orchestration of a moment that would allow truth to reveal itself. He returned to the hall, carrying a small selection of items from his office, a notebook, a few scraps of paper, and a fresh set of breadcrumbs. Eloise Havisham greeted him with her usual calm and precise demeanour, and Purbright observed the crows settling around her, alert but accustomed to her presence. "Good morning, Eloise," he said, sitting on the low wall nearby. "The town has been busy, and the crows as well. But I have a few small questions for you, if you don't mind." She nodded, her hands busy with scattering crumbs. "I am listening." Purbright began with minor, neutral inquiries, gently probing her awareness of the sketches, the bakery incident, and the subtle traces of movement in the alley. Eloise's responses were consistent and careful. She maintained honesty while giving no indication of knowledge beyond her own actions. Her clarity and composure reinforced what he had long suspected. She was neither culpable for the second incident nor deliberately misleading. Satisfied, he allowed a brief pause, then stood and retrieved a new sketch he had prepared himself. It depicted a scene similar to the previous ones, but with minor adjustments: the placement of the bins, the trajectory of crumbs, and the positions of two figures, one small, crouched among birds, the other taller, standing nearby. He pinned it subtly on the hall door and retreated to an observing position, mindful of the alley and surrounding streets. Within minutes, a figure emerged, cautious and deliberate, moving toward the sketch. The posture was careful, the head tilted as if assessing changes. Purbright observed the subtle adjustments made to the bins, the careful placement of small objects, and the deliberate movements designed to interact with the environment without overt disturbance. The precision confirmed his previous deductions. This was the hidden actor, attentive and purposeful. Rather than confrontation, Purbright approached calmly, stepping into view and producing a gentle smile. "Good morning," he said, his tone polite and measured. "I hope the sketch did not surprise you too greatly." The figure froze, eyes flicking toward him, a subtle tension in posture, but no panic. The careful movement slowed, suggesting an awareness of observation without outright fear. "I have been noting your work here," Purbright continued, "and I must say it is remarkably precise. Your attention to detail, your understanding
of human behavior, and the subtle way you test the environment, it is impressive."
The hidden actor's eyes widened slightly. yet the calm tone seemed to mitigate alarm. Purbright continued, speaking of minor observations without accusation, the flour in the bakery, the placement of crumbs, the sketches, and the faint footprints. Each detail was presented with neutrality, acknowledging presence without condemnation. Purbright waited a few moments before following at a discreet distance. He did not intend confrontation yet. Observation was the priority. The figure passed the bakery, casting a quick glance inside before continuing toward the high street where shop windows reflected a ghostly image of movement. It was clear that this person was familiar with the town's rhythms and attentive to the presence of others. The careful avoidance of public notice suggested experience and patience, hallmarks of a mind accustomed to subtle influence. Later, Purbright called upon Mr. Jowett, sharing his observations and soliciting insight. "The individual moves with precision," he said. "Not clumsy, not hurried, yet clearly testing boundaries. What can you tell me about potential townsfolk who exhibit such traits?" Jowett considered carefully. "There are a few, sir. People who value observation and subtle control, someone accustomed to understanding small details, who watches others while remaining unseen. Mr. Lovelace certainly, though he has been under close observation himself. Miss Trenchard, perhaps, though she is more cerebral than tactile. And others. The new clerk at the post office, recently transferred, moves quietly and notices everything." Purbright nodded. He did not exclude anyone, but he catalogued these traits carefully. Patience, subtlety, deliberate testing of the environment, attention to human reactions, and a measured interaction with objects and space. These were the markers of his hidden actor. By midday, he visited the bakery, ostensibly to discuss flour orders with Mr. Bletchley. While chatting politely, he observed reactions, noting how the baker positioned his body, how his hands lingered near the register, and how he glanced toward the alley and the rear entrance. Each movement was slight, almost imperceptible, yet collectively they formed a web of attentiveness that could not be ignored. Purbright made careful mental notes, resisting the urge to voice suspicion, for the real test would be subtle, a gentle question, a staged observation, an invitation to reveal intent without accusation. Returning to the hall, Purbright spent time with Eloise, casually asking questions about her routine, the placement of the crows, and her awareness of other children or visitors. Her responses were consistent and precise, revealing both honesty and a disciplined attention to her own patterns. She did not hint at knowledge of the second actor, yet her behavior indirectly confirmed the presence of an external influence. The careful choreography of the flour, crumbs, and sketches could not have arisen spontaneously. By late afternoon, he staged a second minor test. He rearranged the bins in the alley slightly differently, pinned a fresh sketch in an inconspicuous spot, and scattered a few crumbs in a pattern deliberately divergent from the prior arrangements. Then he retreated to an upstairs window, observing the alley and nearby streets with quiet patience. It did not take long for the hidden actor to respond. A figure approached cautiously, moving deliberately past the new sketch, tilting the head as though assessing changes. The bins were examined, a subtle adjustment made, and the individual paused briefly before retreating into the side lane. Purbright's careful observation confirmed what he had suspected. The person responded to environmental cues, reacted to minor interventions, and acted with attention and precision, yet avoided confrontation or obvious recognition. That evening, Purbright reflected on the day's results. The test had confirmed the presence of someone attentive, patient, and deliberately interactive with the town's microcosm. The second actor was real, methodical, and capable of subtle orchestration, without detection. Importantly, they had shown awareness of his own minor interventions, suggesting intelligence and attentiveness beyond casual mischief. He reviewed the list of possible suspects, considering traits, habits, and access to locations. Each candidate was evaluated not for motive alone, but for behavioral consistency with observed actions, subtlety, patience, and deliberate engagement with minor environmental cues. The patterns were clear. The town had been quietly observed, tested, and gently manipulated, with Eloise as an unwitting participant rather than the orchestrator. By late evening, Purbright took a final walk through the market square, observing the townsfolk returning home, children playing quietly, and shopkeepers finishing their day's tasks. The town appeared calm, but beneath the surface, the minor disturbances had shifted attention and subtly tested assumptions. Small towns, he reflected, were both observant and vulnerable. The smallest interventions could ripple through social consciousness, and the hidden actor had exploited this with remarkable subtlety. Purbright returned to his office, cataloguing his notes, sketches, observations, and reflections. The test had yielded confirmation, narrowing possibilities and highlighting the behavioral markers of the individual responsible for the second incident. He knew the next steps would involve careful, direct questioning, a polite, deliberate probe designed to elicit reaction and reveal truth without confrontation or alarm. The night settled over Flaxborough, the crows roosting quietly, the alley calm, and the town's residents unaware of the subtle narrative unfolding around them. Purbright, calm and patient, prepared for the next stage, a careful test of the hidden actor, one that would draw them out through observation, behavior, and the understated precision for which the town was now an unwitting stage. He sipped his tea, allowing satisfaction to settle quietly alongside anticipation. The pattern was nearly complete. The final revelations would require only a gentle, polite prod to uncover what patient observation had already revealed. The following morning brought a calmness that belied the subtle tension underlying Flaxborough's quiet streets. Purbright moved through the town with measured steps, observing the normal rhythm of shopkeepers preparing for business, children lingering near the schoolyard, and postmen adjusting their rounds with habitual precision. There was a faint sense of expectancy in the air, unspoken but perceptible to those attuned to minor irregularities. For Purbright, the day was dedicated not to pursuit, but to resolution, the careful orchestration of a moment that would allow truth to reveal itself. He returned to the hall, carrying a small selection of items from his office, a notebook, a few scraps of paper, and a fresh set of breadcrumbs. Eloise Havisham greeted him with her usual calm and precise demeanour, and Purbright observed the crows settling around her, alert but accustomed to her presence. "Good morning, Eloise," he said, sitting on the low wall nearby.
The town has been busy, and the crows as well, but I have a few small questions for you if you don't mind. She nodded, her hands busy with scattering crumbs. I am listening.
Purbright began with minor, neutral inquiries, gently probing her awareness of the sketches, the bakery incident, and the subtle traces of movement in the alley. Eloise's responses were consistent and careful. She maintained honesty while giving, no indication of knowledge beyond her own actions. Her clarity and composure reinforced what he had long suspected. She was neither culpable for the second incident nor deliberately misleading. Satisfied, he allowed a brief pause, then stood and retrieved a new sketch he had prepared himself. It depicted a scene similar to the previous ones, but with minor adjustments: the placement of the bins, the trajectory of crumbs, and the positions of two figures, one small, crouched among birds, the other taller, standing nearby. He pinned it subtly on the hall door and retreated to an observing position, mindful of the alley and surrounding streets. Within minutes, a figure emerged, cautious and deliberate, moving toward the sketch. The posture was careful, the head tilted as if assessing changes. Purbright observed the subtle adjustments made to the bins, the careful placement of small objects, and the deliberate movements designed to interact with the environment without overt disturbance. The precision confirmed his previous deductions. This was the hidden actor, attentive and purposeful. Rather than confrontation, Purbright approached calmly, stepping into view and producing a gentle smile. "Good morning," he said, his tone polite and measured. "I hope the sketch did not surprise you too greatly." The figure froze, eyes flicking toward him, a subtle tension in posture but no panic. The careful movements slowed, suggesting an awareness of observation, without outright fear. "I have been noting your work here," Purbright continued, "and I must say it is remarkably precise. Your attention to detail, your understanding of human behavior, and the subtle way you test the environment, it is impressive." The hidden actor's eyes widened slightly, yet the calm tone seemed to mitigate alarm. Purbright continued, speaking, "Of minor observations without accusation, the flour in the bakery, the placement of crumbs, the sketches, and the faint footprints. Each detail was presented with neutrality, acknowledging presence without condemnation.